Bandwidth provided by Recursive Squirrel Interactive. Transcription services provided by transcribeme.com. Episode 539, Creative as a Media. Monday, April 8th, 2019. It's time for this week's edition of the BeanCast, a weekly discussion about the news and issues facing marketers today. I'm your host, Bob Norp. Thanks for joining us. The ad world took a pause for introspection this week after Accenture announced a deal to acquire creative shop Droga5. Many wondered if this was the beginning of the end of agencies as we know it, or just a new model worth pursuing. Tonight, we'll discuss. Also, how digital could bring about a TV resurgence, reach versus quality and visibility standards, what to consider as DTC goes public, plus this week's Ad Fail 5. That's the lineup. Let's meet tonight's panel. Thanks for joining us for this week's BeanCast. I'm Bob Norp, and with me on the panel for this evening, we start with the author of 6 Pixels of Separation and Control-Alt-Delete, the founder of the 6 Pixels group, Mr. Mitch Joel. Hi, Mitch.
Hey, Bobby. How are you?
I'm doing well. Now, joining him is the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Marketing for Edison Research, writer, speaker, podcaster, Mr. Tom Webster. Tom, you've had a busy time, haven't you?
I have, but I would still never call you Bobby.
I'm the only one who does. That's the joke. He giggles and I giggle.
I can be called Bobby if occasionally. Occasionally. Mitch has that special place in my heart where he gets to call me Bobby.
Right.
Well, let's jump right into it. First up, it's been a busy week this week for the ad world. It's easy to dismiss the threat of management consultancies by pointing out their lack of marquee advertising bona fides. Boy, I can't even speak this morning. Well, all of this changed this week with the planned acquisition of Droga5 by Accenture. Mitch, what does this move signal for you? This is a big deal because the ad world has been concerned about the management consultancy model moving in on their turf, but we kind of dismiss them as being just about services. And suddenly here they are, actually muscling in on our turf.
Well, I mean, there's a bit of history that I think we need to look at and structure first before sort of thinking about it. One is what people may or may not know is that going back to 2013, William Morris Endeavor at the time, now known as Endeavor, actually acquired about 49% of Droga5. They're saying for about $115 million. By 2018, Droga5 was already talking about how they wanted out of this deal. So if you think about the timeline, what's really happened here is Accenture has acquired the 49% that Droga5 doesn't own. And I'm not saying that doesn't make it an acquisition. It still makes an acquisition, not a controlling one, but they're there. And again, on the other side of knowing a bit about what's going on here, Endeavor is in the midst of rumors of an IPO, and they sort of needed maybe a bit of a play in to get rid of an asset that may not have been fitting in with the model that they would be establishing post-IPO. So when we talk about it in relation to what's happened now, my personal surprise wasn't so much Droga5 in as much as I really thought that Accenture or some of the other management consultant companies, PwCs, Deloitte's of the world, were actually going to make a bigger play, believe it or not, but for the holdcos. And I do know that in this case, Accenture did make a play for MDC back in December that didn't come together like it should have. So right. Here we have with this acquisition.
I'm so glad you said this because this is exactly what I thought. I mean, when I heard about the news about Droga5 getting acquired, I wasn't so concerned about them having a creative shop and going head to head in pitches with the same type of talent, the same type of agency services that the rest of the ad world had. I thought it signaled a bigger play that somehow they're starting to look at the holding company model and say, we can be a holding company as well. And it's a potential better model for holding companies.
Well, this is the thing that starts sort of itching me in a non-positive way, because what happens is people go, well, these holding companies have very traditional models and they're being extremely disrupted by the consulting groups, and it just looks like there's just acquisition on the consulting group side. This sort of bet on disruption, that the prices are collapsing within the holding company model or within maybe these agency models, and they can grab them for a song and a dance. But this doesn't mean that the Accentures of the world have a better business model. It's still a very traditional business model, unless they're presenting us with some sort of new business model that none of us have seen. But what I would say is that I feel like it is really not necessarily consolidation, but more of a commoditization of media, right? If you think about it, the agency model was really driven by the media purchasing. And the idea of the creative came within that, but creative in terms of the actual revenue was a much smaller fraction. In fact, in the early days, the creativity was tossed in basically for free just to get the media dollars out of it. And I think what's happening now in terms of this commoditization strategy is that the strategy and the planning is suddenly the same thing as the creative, right? That sort of near free model. And again, the Accentures of the world and the PwCs of the world are really good at the strategy and planning side. And so if it's true that they're willing to give up that part of the business to get the media, to also get the creative and have some creative dollars flowing through, I see it being an interesting little sort of connection point, that almost like strategy and planning is the new creative that you sort of toss in to sort of get the bigger part of the work. What will integration look like between Droga 5 and Accenture? Of course, in the press release, they're talking about how nothing will change, but I think we all know that everything's going to change.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. First of all, clarify for me a little bit what you're saying, because it sounds like you're saying that creative is actually a valuable commodity in the agency world. I mean, I'm sorry, in the management consultancy model that's being expressed right now, that somehow creative and strategy are important, and that you're giving away what is it giving away?
Well, yeah, so I'll clarify that. The old model was you got the business for the media and you sort of tossed in the creative.
Right.
And I think that what's happening now is they're going to toss in the strategy and the planning, because creative is the new media. I really do think that. And I think Droga 5 has really demonstrated, if you look at their portfolio over the years, that they really are a company that wasn't driven by quote unquote ads, but they were driven much more by content as media and storytelling and overall encompassing brand strategies and brand plays. And yeah, I mean, this has been the biggest sort of taunt, if you will, from the holding companies and independent agencies towards the consultancies making the play in the marketing services space, is that, well, they lack creativity, they lack storytelling, they lack content. They're good to tell you what to do or how to do it or where to do it, but not good at executing on it. And these are the steps that these companies like Accenture have to take. And so, yeah, in the old model where you sort of did the work for the media and the creative was free, I think in the new world of Accenture, they're willing to forego the strategy and planning because the creative is going to take on the role of media.
You know, our good friend Bob Hoffman had a lot to say about this week, and he had some interesting points to be made about Droga 5. And it made me wonder whether or not Accenture made a good move by purchasing this company, because, you know, from a standpoint of reputation right now among advertisers, Droga 5 still holds a certain cachet as being a really hot creative shop. However, the ad world as a whole kind of looks at them, or is starting to look at them as a has-been, something that was great but is not as great as it once was, not as hot as it once was, and that there's a lagging indicator at this point out there in the marketplace that, you know, continues to say this is a great shop. So I'm wondering how much value they're going to get out of this acquisition. Is it going to be a short-term play, or can they actually make it into something that's long-term and valuable for them?
Well, I read a lot of the comments from various ad agencies and advertising executives and also Bob Hoffman, and it just, gosh, it read a lot like YouTube comments hating on, you know, I mean, it just honestly, it looked like a cesspool of jealousy.
Yeah,
and you know, the whole thing looks to me like it's, you know, it's the classic debate of build versus buy, and you've had creative shops saying, all right, we've built this creative shop. and we can buy the analytics. That's no big deal. And now you have Accenture saying, well, we have built this great, kind of analytics strategy. We've built the science part, and now we can buy the art. And I'm not sure who's right here, but all of a sudden, Droga 5 went from creative darlings to last of the independents, and this is really sad. And it looked like a whole lot of jealousy to me, frankly, from people who think they should have been bought, but they weren't.
Yeah, and I would add on a couple of thoughts to that. The jealousy factor and the independent factor is a misnomer. One, because they weren't independent. They were 49% owned by William Morris Endeavor. So they were independent of holding company, but they were not an independent organization. Their revenue is somewhere around $245 million a year. And I can tell you that any independent or agency that's outside of the realm of a holding company would have a jaw drop on that. And where I think Tom is exceptionally correct is on the fact that it really was a play of scale. And what I mean by that is I don't know how relevant the portfolio is or how well Droga 5 is seen as a creative shop in the industry, but I can point to one thing, which is this is business. And if Accenture wants to make a real significant move into the marketing services space and they can't acquire a holding company, why don't you tell me what other shops may be available at that size and scale currently? And the answer is very few, if any.
Very few,
and they didn't have much of a choice here. If they had failed on that NDC acquisition, they actually want to get in the game, there was not many other ports of call.
There's one thing that you mentioned, Mitch, that I want to follow up on. You talked about the commoditization of creative as media. I like the model. I like the thinking, and I can understand what the intention was on Accenture when I understand it in this light. But at the same time, doesn't this move actually serve to highlight and amplify the importance of agencies in the mix? I mean, they just bought a huge marquee name agency, and it seems to me like that doesn't add value to the Accenture name as much as it says agencies are still important. Is that your takeaway, or am I kind of reading too much into this?
No, you're exactly in the level of frustration I experienced and while we were growing out Miram, which I left in July of this year, and seeing this global digital agency that was sort of top right quadrant in Gartner's quadrants or whatever they call them, and looking at, at the time, 2,500 employees in 2,700 countries, doing really cutting edge stuff, not just because I was there, but it really was an amazing portfolio to see, and having everyone say, well, the traditional agencies and WPPs are on the outs and on the outs. And here I am watching all these consultants basically acquire the talent or the agencies and not change the model at all. And it's exactly to your point, which is how do we sit in this world and go, agencies are a thing of the past, holding companies are a thing of the past, this is the future, and all this future is doing is acquiring that and not changing the model. And this is my exact frustration with this. It is vanity, it's a fashion statement, none of it is based in any form of reality. If you told me, hey, the real disruption that's happening to holdcos and agencies is in the fact that smart brands are bringing this work inside and the talent is now there and willing to work on that side of the business, I'd say to you, we're onto something. This is a changing model. But that's not the argument. And that's my point of frustration 100%.
Tom, you're obviously an outsider. You're not somebody who's coming at it from the agency standpoint, but I'd love your thoughts on what exactly the holding companies or the agencies out there, independent agencies, need to do in response to a move like this. Is it as Mitch says, that the agencies are still relevant and that they're still important, and how do they respond and how do they act and how do they go up head to head against a behemoth like Accenture and what they're doing?
When I was in business school, I had an HR professor who posited this theory called the sprinkler company theory. Bear with me here.
Okay.
And he had done research into sprinkler companies, like companies that install sprinkler systems in buildings.
Right.
And he had discovered that none of them could get beyond 50 employees or about $12.5 million in revenue, or they would break up because they could not be managed at that level. They stopped being scalable at that level. The entrepreneur there was no longer a theory of the firm at that point. And so they just stayed at that size. And I look at a shop like Droga 5, and I think Droga 5 was too big to be a practice and was verging on to being a company, if it as it were. And at some point, it just feels like this giant respiratory system where the holding companies inhale all these companies and then they exhale them, and then they inhale them and they exhale them. And I don't know where it goes at this point, but a truly creative shop, I think, and Mitch may completely disagree with me, is a finite organism. It's a little colony body within a larger organism, and when it gets ingested and it's not left whole, it doesn't have as much value.
But the truth is, and again, you're not wrong, sort of philosophically speaking, maybe even practically speaking. But the truth is, if you look at the holding company, and this is again part of my general frustration, not because I come from a holding company, I was wholly independent for close to 15 years before being acquired by WPP, but I can tell you that upon acquisition, you don't become a part of much. I mean, if you actually, what is WPP? WPP is hundreds of independent agencies basically doing their own thing. In fact, more often than not, competing against each other. Over the years, I can't tell you how many times I competed against people within WPP. In fact, at the time when Martin Sorrell was running the organization, he loved it. Better to have 3 to 5 agencies up for a big pitch that are all his, because one of them will win it, even though it seems like a complete waste of resources. And can't you all work together? That was never the strategy. It's not the strategy that you see in Publicis. It's not the one you see in Dentsu. It's not the one you see in the IPG world or Omnicom. You just don't see it. These are hundreds of independent shops that are basically working autonomously. Now, here we sit in the day and age where suddenly we're being disrupted by the management consultants. And now, as they seem to consolidate a little bit more, I mean, again, we fell into the sort of J. Walter Thompson world, which is now Wenderman Thompson. So they merged these two to create an agency. Is it still an agency that is part of WPP? It is. Does WPP have real input? I'm sure they kind of do, but to a certain degree, they're just running their clients and their business. And I think the more important question to really ask is this: where does great creativity in our space truly come from? Does it come from in-house teams? Does it come from the consultants? Are we seeing it mostly from freelancers? Are we seeing it mostly from independent agencies? Or are we seeing it mostly from agencies that are part of some form of holding company? Now, I would argue that technically, percentage-wise, it's probably part of the holding companies. Why? Because these companies get good and efficient to become bigger, and they become acquisition targets by these companies.
You're making my point for me, though, Mitch. Honestly,
no, when you say
that nothing changes, when you say that when a holding company purchases these smaller agencies, that nothing changes, that is part and parcel of the problem. Like, what at that point, what is the theory of the firm? What are you working for? When you're with a smaller agency, there is a theory of the firm. There is a practice. There is a point of view. And if you're purchased by this holding company and you say nothing changes, what then is the theory of the firm? What is the thing? What is the thing that you're working towards?
Right. That was always the criticism of WPP as a whole. I mean, as being the biggest of all the holding companies. That Martin Sorrell, he looked at the business as kind of a bank. I mean, it wasn't a operation. It wasn't an advertising agency. It wasn't even an ad service company. It was entirely a bank, and it was about all these contributing companies putting their money into the bank, and then him generating profit out of it. I think that when your theories like that, the model works to an extent, but it doesn't really do anything for the work as a whole. I mean, it doesn't.
Okay, but I'm not defending the model of WPP, nor am I negating what Tom is saying. I think things do change. There is a better back-end system. There is an efficiency model that if your business isn't efficient, they can overlay into that. Some like it, some don't. Is it as entrepreneurial as when the creative or leaders are running it? Maybe a little less. I'd agree there. And again, I'm not saying that this is a Pollyanna, this model works great. All I'm saying is, in comparison to what we're seeing with an Accenture Droga 5 acquisition, in comparison to that, I'm still saying, where does the creative live? And I'm willing to bet that the better creative we see in market, the better marketing plans we see in market, is coming from agencies that are primarily owned by some form of holding company. And I don't see that being a stifle to the Accenture Droga 5 deal, I don't think it's going to knock them out or have them not be creative or have them go down that road at all. I just see this purely as Accenture needed to get into this space, and they needed to do it in a big way. And Droga 5 was one of the few solutions.
There's only two more things I want to bring up on this subject before we move on. And first up is that when you look at the Accenture acquisition, it's kind of we're assuming that they're going to do some kind of integrated approach. They're going to take all this talent that they're getting from Droga 5 and they're going to marry it to the rest of the consulting practice, and that there's going to be some kind of synergy, some kind of business model that, like what Tom's talking about, that's going to take it forward, and it's going to be a different model. And that's on the one side of the scale. On the other side of the scale, you have the mega agency approach, which is not the holding company, but more like Wyden Kennedy. Wyden Kennedy being the last big independent. They're too big to acquire, arguably too big to acquire, but they're doing arguably some of the best work still after all this time. And I'm wondering whether or not these two factors, this management consultancy model that marries all these skills together into one business-oriented pitch, one business-oriented set of services, and on one side of the fence, and the other side, the mega agency approach, if either of those models might be more effective than the holding company model that you described, Mitch, where businesses inside the holding company are starting to compete with each other.
My thoughts are that I think Droga 5 will continue to be the creative shop they have been, and they'll figure out their lifespan as they evolve and grow and change. I mean, this is a business that, is still somewhat newish. It's a decade plus that it's been around. Where I think it's going to go is simply that it's going to alleviate a lot of the pressure that a company like Droga 5 has on business development. Because what's going to happen is there's going to be a flood and a natural push towards, obviously, if you want to get this done, we've got this great partner in Droga 5. And that's going to be, I think that's going to be a heavy stress alleviated from this agency in terms of their growth, because there's going to be a very healthy funnel and pipeline thanks to Accenture. And that's going to push them in a direction. It's going to make them the most creative. It's tough to say. It depends on the types of clients they bring to the table and the type of agency they want to be.
Well, good conversation, but it's time to move on. There was a fascinating opinion piece in Adweek examining how digital could be the key to a resurgence in television's power and dominance. But Mitch, the one question I'm left with after reading this is whether or not this article is even talking about a resurgence of television or the rise of something more like television-like. It's like, are we just talking about, broadcast TV getting a new lease on life, or is this something different? Is this more about linear TV existing on digital platforms?
It's funny, when I saw you send this article, I sort of did a double take, because in February at some point I wrote an article called "Is TV Advertising the Next Big Thing in Advertising?" And it was somewhat reactionary to a piece that was in Digiday about direct-to-consumer brands and how these direct-to-consumer brands, which I know we're going to talk about again later, are embracing TV or more open to TV. And I thought, well, this is the most absurd thing I have ever heard. But if you stop and think about what's happening here, and we'll get, I want to get to the point of this article, but I want to talk about this other issue that I think ties into it nicely, is that the price of advertising on Google and Facebook is going up dramatically, to the point where TV is now becoming somewhat more accessible to these DTC brands, and at scale, obviously, to brands that are larger. The problem, of course, is there's very little first-party data. There's very little data. Forget first-party data. For a lot of brands, they're looking for more direct response, and it's harder to track and understand it. But if you think about this article now, it's really, really interesting that TV is still not data specific. You could say that it's not even data driven, really, because it's sort of the results come from all these other places. And this story of, is TV growing up? I think TV is growing up. It's reacting to the fact that brands want to better understand the audience. They better want to understand the relevancy. They better want to understand the repetition of it. I think also just a general thought is that there's a real lack of true attention measures. So yeah, we know that the ad had ran somewhere, but we really don't know if the consumer had any attention towards it. And so there's this interesting balance happening now, and I think it's really profound that they're talking about digital TV advertising as this sort of next wave, and I'm wondering if the real wave that's coming is just it's simply more affordable.
Something that's kind of weighing on my mind as you're talking about this is we buy advertising for television based on reach. I mean, it's always been about reach, and then you marry that with frequency, and everything's going extremely well. That's how you get attention, and that's why TV is so powerful. But when we're targeting so effectively at the audience and making TV more digital and doing dynamic ad insertion, I mean, Tom, tell me, am I wrong here by saying we're diluting reach by doing that? I mean, you can still get reach, but it's not the same kind of reach. It's not that, everybody is seeing the same ad at the same time via a broadcast channel.
No, it's not the same kind of reach, but I think I think television is in a bit of a transition time, and not for the reasons why, people might think. I think there's going to be more consolidation in TV, and I think there's going to be more kind of portfolio building in television, because television is obviously not dead. I mean, you can still, there's still tremendous reach involved with television, but what's happened with digital is that we've gone from this constricted pipe where even 500 cable channels doesn't seem like enough, so there's no real long tail, into this giant long tail. And so what is most important now? It's the hit. And at this point, quote unquote television doesn't have as much claim to the hit as it used to, because we're seeing the hit become much more widely distributed. So if that's the case, then it's incumbent upon the traditional television players, to bid and compete for the hits, but also to bid and compete for the long tail in a way that they haven't before.
And this is go ahead, Tom. Sorry.
No, Mitch, please.
Well, what I was going to say is that there's another effect happening that layers on top of what Tom said so intelligently, which is, I'll call it the Netflix effect, but it's bigger than that, because we've changed consumer habits in terms of binging, delayed watching, whatever you want to call it. It also changes the dynamics of what is a hit. And what I mean by this is I've been spending some time with the folks at CAA out in Los Angeles, and they genuinely talk about this, that you don't have this sort of institutional shows anymore. And the reason being is that people really see these shows as they're being produced today as these 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 or 5 season shows that could be tossed up onto a platform like Netflix and binge watch within a couple of weeks. And this idea of having this sort of mass phenom that absorbs culture, and that we all talk about, that sort of water cooler, that 8 p.m. on Thursday, always, must see TV, is all but gone. And that's going to have a massive impact, not only on TV and advertising, of course, especially with models like Netflix, which are subscription-based, which impact your advertising, or HBO, that it changes everything. And the struggle of this article to me was more about how is TV going to really deliver on first-party data? If they want to really have that win, that's what they're going to have to deliver to brands today. Just having this mass reach doesn't really matter all that much. And I say that with full respect to the brand safety issues and what we're seeing on YouTube. But there's just this habit changing, this Netflix effect that is going to really put into question who wants to be a part of a show that might not have any longevity. And that's fine, because that's just the nature of the beast now.
Well, I think the networks, especially, and sort of the larger television, both broadcast and cable, again, I think they're still amalgamating hits, but they don't have a long tail strategy, and it's the long tail strategy that is actually where a lot of the back catalog dynamic ad insertion and all that stuff goes in, to be able to say, all right, I know we can get a 3% share of men 18 to 34 on this show, but when they turn off, where do they go? We're losing them to Netflix. We're losing them to some of these more kind of niche networks. So what's the long tail strategy of television when it's not digital, and that I think is why things are very much in transition right now.
And it gets even more complicated in the sense that, how long are TV networks really going to even know their customers? I mean, right now they're totally dependent upon cable companies, but as 5G starts to roll out, then it becomes more a province of the telephone companies controlling all the data on consumers. I mean,
man, have you hit on something here? I mean, Bob, you have hit upon the crux of this, because what we're really talking about is what you can measure,
right?
And Nielsen, and just as the smartphone has completely upended Nielsen audio, and the sort of personal people meter, electronic passive measurement of radio and things like that, it just falls apart when you're listening on the cell phone. They have a solution for it. It's not good. And as we begin to watch more and more television content on 5G with our mobile devices, the inability to measure it is what's going to doom it more than audiences. And I'm not saying it's doomed, but it's a serious problem. If you can't measure it, it didn't exist.
And it's not like on the other side it's much better. You'd think this would be so much better on the YouTube side and the media, and it's not. And again, when you speak to the people who are really good at this, and again, I do point to people like Tom and Edison Research who do this for a living, they're measuring black holes. How do you measure a black hole? By the light and movement around it. But that's not actually what's happening. And so there's all these different types of ways of looking at it when we don't really know. And I think that you're right. If you look at what happens from once the show is finished and ready for airing and all the channels it goes through, it is almost absurd if you look at even a banner ad and to look at all the pipes it has to go through before it gets displayed in front of a consumer, to almost laugh at how we didn't even learn from that mistake. But I do believe that digital still adds a bit more clarity to it, or it's a bit more specific, or a bit more individualized or personalized, or however you want to call it. But this TV challenge is going nowhere. And I was shouting back to that Digiday article on DTC brands only because it really does demonstrate that maybe the future of TV advertising is just being a very good price to access an audience, and you play it from there.
Is there a role for linear television in this world that's completely on demand? I mean, it's just like we keep talking about this in terms of, the way people now consume content. They binge it, they watch it all together. There is no common tentpole show that everybody's tuning in at the same time watching. But yet there are shows that are still tentpoles, and there are still opportunities for live programming to capture at least the attention of a large portion of the audience to tune in at the same time. And I'm wondering, how long will that last? I mean, how time shifting are we that we're never going to want to have any kind of linear programming again?
Go ahead, Tom.
You're seeing a bifurcation of the audience is what you're seeing. I mean, we all used to gather around the altar of the television set to watch Seinfeld and ER and must-see TV and things like that. There is still a portion of the American population that will continue to do that. And, economically and basically just how much they care about media, there's another portion that is split off, and they're much more choosy, and they want to kind of craft their media experience. But what you're going to see in television is kind of what you have seen in radio for the past 10 years, which is radio is still throwing off an awful lot of cash flow. It's just a lot of advertisements for, vape shops and skateboard places and adult clubs and, all that other kind of stuff, because that's who's listening to a lot of those stations. The advertising is getting more targeted. The audience is getting bifurcated. But there's always going to be this split between lean back and lean forward. And television for years has had both audiences, but linear television is going to increasingly be the provenance of the lean back audience. And that's an audience. It's just a smaller audience.
And I would add to that, like live is just an interesting thing when it comes to sports, when it comes to news, commentary, a little bit of reality TV. I find that we're changing our consumer and viewing habits when it comes to serials and that sort of ongoing thing. I'm just thinking about my own usage, and it's a market of one, so never take that for much. But waiting each week for an episode of Billions is becoming an increasingly frustrating experience in a world where Amazon will launch a series like Amazon Prime will launch a series like Hannah, and I don't watch it in one sitting. It takes time, but at least I can choose. And I think once you've opened up that Pandora's box of allowing people to choose, which ergo led us to binge watching, I think it creates a level of frustration on the other side, and it makes, to me, TV feels somewhat slower and more traditional because of it. It's like when you take the choice away, you take away my feeling that it is more modern or technologically forward moving. So I think there's a bit of that, and I think that you're right, Bob, that when you think about live sporting events and stuff like that, it works because it is of the moment and in the moment, and there's something very powerful about that. And news is another great example of it.
Well, another great read that I had this week was from Digiday, examining whether we should be measuring views or quality of views as a price determinant in terms of the programmatic value of an ad. Tom, we all know the issue with the current IAB viewability standards. I mean, that whole half on the page for 1 second thing is just a butt of jokes everywhere. But is the problem really lying with whether to count the minimum as a view, or that we're still measuring and valuing reach over quality of reach?
Well, I think it's the latter, Bob. I think we're still measuring reach over the quality of reach. And, we've come out of a period of time, even 5 years ago, where we had to measure analog dollars versus digital pennies. But I think now we're kind of in digital dimes, or whatever is the next base 10 system up from that. But it's still not quite enough to support the kind of ad effectiveness measures that analog media has relied upon for years.
Right.
We do a crap ton of advertising effectiveness measures for television, for radio, for print, and they cost X amount of dollars. And we can do them for digital as well. They will still cost X amount of dollars. And if digital media is a lower CPM, that's still kind of a bit of a level set for people. And we're starting to kind of get more of that business. But, at the end of the day, you're still measuring people based upon, did they hear a thing and did it change their mind? Did it change their behavior? Did it at least put your brand in their consideration set? And, from our perspective as a company that measures all that stuff, whether you heard it on a radio ad or saw it on TV or saw it on digital display or heard it in a podcast, it's kind of the same level of effort for us to measure it. And one of the things about the article that you shared, which will be in the show notes, that rung true with me and kind of made me laugh, is that that kind of measurement of advertising effectiveness remains better with television, print, and radio than it does with digital.
I'll tell you the quote that really made me perk up and get excited about this segment of the show, not that I'm not excited about this one, is the quote that said that viewability is not a metric anymore. It's basic hygiene. And I thought that, wow, that is a very profound statement that is begging for disruption. And then you have to ask the question of what is disruption? And what I believe, and I'm open to debate here between all of us, is I think we need to kill both of those metrics, both quality or non-quality. I think they're both terrible questions. I think the question we need to ask is attention. If we're putting an ad in front of somebody, did they pay attention to it? I can run an ad and fold my phone over and put it face down, and it's an ad and it counts. I can play an ad in one of my tabs and click to another tab in my browser, and it's going to be counted the same way, whether it be considered a quality because of a.
But are you splitting hairs here?
No,
because I mean,
not
it's
at
just
all.
like
I think you are, Mitch.
Yeah, because
you're kind of
no.
making up. You're changing the nomenclature, but I think we're still talking about the same thing.
I don't know. I think that they see views as quality views as being a more targeted view towards the right audience, and the right audience, quote unquote, seeing it when they don't even know what seeing it is. And I think if you look at it in terms of prime real estate, you have to pay more for the bigger the ad or where it's placed. I don't know if those are the metrics. I think the metric should be attention.
No,
Did the
no
person
doubt.
sing it, pay attention to it?
There's no doubt that the metrics that are being applied to quality of view are probably broken at this point, and they
Right.
need to be evolved. And I understand what you're saying about attention, but ultimately, what we're still talking about is that instead of buying 1 million views, you're buying 10,000 views, and all of those views are paying attention to your ad, or at least a larger majority of them. So that makes for a more quality experience for the advertiser. The trouble is, the advertiser is not willing to pay the extra amount of money for that quality of view.
Right. That's exactly
and the publisher is getting screwed. So there's this huge inertia out there about actually making a change like this. How do you move past that?
Well, it's not, I mean, look, one is that's the nail on the head. And the other part of that is that the businesses truly don't want to change, because if we move towards that model, what ultimately happens is the numbers are smaller. And if the numbers are smaller, many people on both the buying and the selling side believe that everything implodes. Like, what if all of a sudden the truth is that the people who watch my show, it's not 3 million people, but really 300,000 people? Then I can't charge as much for it anymore, because they're still using that number as the metric versus the attention or quality of the audience. And there's why you're not going to see any change, because nobody on the buyer or seller side wants to make that admission. If I go back to the print magazine businesses that I was a part of and publishing before the internet, that was the running joke: circulation. We have 40,000 magazines in circulation. How many people bought it? How many subscribed? How many of them were dumped in the recycling bin at the end of the month? It didn't matter. But if you dropped that number and said, look, I've got 4,000, but they're really engaged readers. They're reading every page. They're passing on to 3 readers per magazine. No media company would even talk to you.
And that's happening in podcasting right now. I mean,
exactly.
That's totally happening in podcasting, as podcasting is biting the bullet and subjecting itself to more stringent standards in terms of filtering, what a download actually really means. And everybody's taking a haircut.
Yep.
And there's
it's not big, or what they're saying, and Tom, and you and I've talked about this off of this show, is brands are saying it's not worth it. There's not enough ears on this.
Right, but that's also an education effort, because if you're saying, well, I could have 100,000 views, or I could have 4,000 engaged people enter in a short code for a direct response thing, how do you know they're any different? And you don't know they're any different until you do the work. And right now, especially with digital, there's still not a real prioritization in terms of a percentage of the buy to put towards the kind of research that determines, was this an effective buy or not? What was the brand lift here? And and again, in kind of radio, television, and print, there's always been that X percent of the buy is going to go towards measuring the effectiveness of it. And there's this mindset with digital that, well, we don't need to do that. We can take the census. We know every single click, but it still doesn't tell you attention. It still doesn't really tell you what's a quality. Does someone actually process the message, and does it actually change what they're doing? And it still comes down to economics. And I think the economics there are going to change. And I'm seeing that in podcasting as this kind of little sandbox of a mix of analog and digital. But that's going to have to happen in purely digital media as well.
Yeah, but I want to see. I want to see the major advertisers come out and play, and major brands come out and play in podcasting. And I'm just not seeing that, and I'm agreeing with you fully, because what's happening
Number
here
2 advertiser in podcasting right now is Geico.
Okay, but it's an anomaly compared to what you see across the board. I mean, if I'm going to listen for how many codes I hear for different pieces of random software, et cetera, versus big brands.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, Bob, as he cuts to a commercial with the but what I'm trying, where I would get it is, I read this article and my real reaction was, well, this is never going to happen, because you're not just upsetting the apple cart, you're basically crushing it and trying to tell everyone to build Amazon there instead. And I just don't see the willpower on the buy or sell side to make that happen, because it creates too much of a reality of what real viewership is, and also what real attention is. And I don't think anyone wants to make that admission, because it's going to be significantly smaller than the numbers this industry is pumping up.
Well, we got to move on to the final topic, running out of time. Direct-to-consumer darling Casper, the mattress company, is set to go public, and their success or failure seems to be shaping up as a referendum of sorts on the entire approach. Tom, first, is this fair for us to be doing this to this one company, saying that you and your success are going to determine whether or not DTC is even effective? And second, what do you hope to learn from this, what's arguably a watershed IPO?
I'm going to answer both of those so quickly, Bob. It is not fair at all. And there's absolutely no conclusion to draw from the success or failure of Casper. None. I'm sort of shocked by this. And let's take a step back on direct-to-consumer brands. We can go back to Avon if you'd like. Direct-to-consumer brands have they don't need Casper to prove or disprove their existence. And honestly, two of the largest direct-to-consumer brands are doing just fine, Nike and Apple.
Yes,
they have retail
I've said
presences.
that. I've said that over and over again, that Apple is a direct-to-consumer brand.
Yeah. Both Nike and Apple have massive direct-to-consumer business, right? I mean, without a doubt, they are two of the largest DTC brands in the world. And there's also all these other kind of DTC brands that are doing just fine. Harry's is doing just fine. I'm a devoted Harry's user. And I think Casper is kind of such an outlier here because, Casper's is almost like, Crocs or Gap Khakis or Khakis, depending on where you grew up. Because how many mattresses are you going to buy in your life? How many times are you really going to touch that brand? Like, I get a shipment from Harry's constantly. I have a deep relationship with Apple, and I get stuff shipped to me from them regularly. How many times am I going to get a foam mattress? Once every 10 years. So I don't think Casper is the appropriate poster child here. And I think there's the people that are kind of making them the poster child of DTC are ignoring the vast, incredible landscape of DTC business that brands like Apple and Nike are doing every day. So I put no stock in this IPO whatsoever as any kind of a harbinger or bellwether of the DTC, health.
Yeah, I think the question is really about whether or not there's health in the mattress business versus any other industry. And up here in Canada, where I live, a separate country from you two, I might add, Endy, which was the sort of Casper of Canada, actually ended up being sold to Sleep Country, which was the massive sort of general retailer up here for that. And again, Tom's going through his list. Dollar Shave Club was sold to Unilever for $1 billion. I mean, Kylie Cosmetics, not public, not acquired, but $1 billion in sales. I mean, the health of businesses that have cut out the middleman, that have drawn from first-party data, that have built databases and subscription models, that have built community, that have some sort of reason people want to connect with it, that have some sort of socially native engine behind it, that are going physical, by the way, at a tremendous pace as they try to grow and build their market. They come across 1 billion different industries, and to be sort of stuck on this one that is now suddenly going IPO in a world where every single day we're seeing that entire space of digitally native vertical brands do exceptionally well. The real question here to me has nothing to do with the questions of this article or this type of editorial. It's simply a question of, well, of course they have to go IPO soon. Have you seen how much money they raised?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they need to do something about that. And I think you guys are bringing up some great points about the DTC space. I mean, its DTC space is going to be just fine whether or not Casper succeeds or doesn't succeed. I think the DTC space has some challenges going forward, and they need to address that. But I don't think that's going to be indicated entirely by an IPO by one company in that space.
And by the way, I just want to add one other thing, which is people who are listening to this segment might be like Nike and Apple, and I have the same reaction. Like, I actually don't agree with you guys. You're right that those are direct-to-consumer brands, and I would even argue maybe not. Like, I'm not sure Nike did much before they were big at retail and had their own distribution. And same with Apple. They had, they decided to take on ownership of the retail, but prior to that, you had to be a vendor and people were selling Apple products through retail. And I don't want to nitpick, but I would say that when we talk about DTC brands in this realm of Casper, what we're talking about really are what they call these DNVB brands, which are digitally native vertical brands. So I don't think that Apple and Nike truly fall into this sector, because you can make arguments for a whole lot of brands, or Avon, which is another example of that. Direct response, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but when we look at that bucket of businesses, we're really talking about, I think the words to focus on are that they're digitally native, that they started off as pure play digital businesses.
So I think it's worth pointing out, I agree with you, Mitch. I think you're 100% right. So let me give you a better example. And that is Glossier, which is a
very good example,
very successful kind of second generation direct-to-consumer brand, and they work because they establish an ongoing relationship. And I would see a company like Glossier a much better bellwether of this whole space than a company that I'm not going to have an ongoing relationship with, and that is my mattress company that I may or may not revisit 10 years from now.
But they are socially native. And the other point that I wanted to jump on in that and intrude a little bit is a lot of the ones, because there's a lot of competition in that space. It's not just about the bed, it's about sleep. For many, it's about the bedroom. They're doing things like lamps and pillows and linens and all this sort of stuff that you would, in theory, be buying more of pillows, every year and wanting new ones and new sets and sheets and colors and stuff like that. So I also want to be fair to the fact that it's a diversification for most of their competitors beyond just mattresses too. But I hear what you're saying, absolutely, that as a core purchase, this is something you buy, once every 10 years, if that. I mean, so it is like that. But I just think we need to sort of at least get the definitions a little bit more tighter, because when I think of DTC now, I really do want to focus on that digitally native, and also what you said, Tom, which is true, the fact that it's socially native too. And I think Glossier is a great example of a very socially native brand as well. Kylie Cosmetics would be another example.
So we should call it a digital to consumer brand?
Well, they're calling them DNVBs, the more nerdy ones, which is a digitally native vertical brand.
Okay, that makes more sense. Well, with that, it's time for the Ad Fail 5. But before we get to that segment of the show, I do want to take this quick opportunity to thank my guests again and allow them to each do a shameless plug, starting with Mitch Joel. You can find him at 6pixels.com. There you can find podcasts, you can find access to his books, you can find access to his blog. The man is always writing, always thinking. Tell us, what would you like to promote, Mitch?
You do that, and I go, that. Thank you very much. Yeah, feel free to check out 6pixels.com, which is really all my spewing all week. And if you're interested in learning more about me and having me maybe speak at your event, please check out mitchjoel.com.
And as for Tom Webster, you can find him at edisonresearch.com. That's the place where he is the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Marketing. Tell us what's going on in your world, Tom. I know you have a lot of reports that have just made their way out into the marketplace.
Well, we have a brand new report coming out on Thursday, April 11th, called the Podcast Consumer 2019. And it's the latest in, we've been covering podcasting for almost 15 years, and we put out this special report, which is a really kind of deep dive into the podcast consumer, their habits, and also the overall kind of share of ear, which we track for podcasting. So that's going to come out April 11th, so just in a couple of days, and you can find information about that on edisonresearch.com. You'll see it right on our homepage, and really looking forward to that.
Fantastic. As for me, for more information about me or the show, visit thebeancast.com. There you can find a complete show archive. You can find out how to consult with me, and you can even find out how to advertise on the program. So check it all out at thebeancast.com. And now it's time for the Ad Fail 5, a rundown of the lowest moments in advertising, marketing, and public relations from the last week. And first up, Bloomberg interviewed over 20 current and former executives at YouTube and discovered that the company's efforts to mitigate brand safety concerns, Tom, continue to take a back seat to driving engagement at all costs, thereby facilitating and promoting the rise of questionable content. It seems like YouTube was in full-on damage control this week because of this article that caused all this stir. I'm not so sure that they are completely at fault for all this, but what's your take on this?
Well, there's a difference between saying they're at fault and saying they're responsible.
Yes.
And I think this is an acknowledgement, and one of many, that YouTube in and of itself is a kind of AI. And that AI is not controllable by humans any longer. It's malignantly complex. And, the belief that some kind of human written algorithm is going to be able to make brands safe on YouTube is a lark at this point.
Good point. Very, very good point. Well, next up, apparently Facebook was beginning to require new users to verify their email address, Mitch, by asking for their email password. I mean, Sketchy doesn't even begin to describe what's going on here. They're actually logging into your email to make sure that your email address is a real email address. Now, they've since stopped this practice and admitted that it was probably not a good idea, but come on.
It's funny. My actual reaction was, if they are actually trying to figure out who's legit and who's not, what other options do they have in this world?
Yeah, but I mean, it's just like, how can logging into someone's email prove that they're a real person? I mean, you can set up an email account to be just as fake as a Facebook page can be set up to be fake, It's just like, all you have to do is populate it with all kinds of information to make it look real.
Well, then asking for it doesn't matter anyways.
Well, I didn't feel comfortable typing my email address in, so I hooked up my Facebook portal, and I aimed it at the address number on my front door, and I stood in front of my front door, and as they suggested, I gave my social security number, and then I gave my password, and I feel like that's like triple opt-in, so I feel safe.
Tom normally likes to hold up a newspaper with today's date on it just to prove, but
I'm just shocked that someone brought up Facebook Portal. I mean, I'm sitting there going, is Facebook Portal even a thing? I mean, it seems like it failed miserably as well. Well, next up, a beach club owner in the Philippines got international attention. I love this story, for telling off so-called influencers that no, their influence and an Instagram post was not the same as cash. Tom, this one's just friggin' amazing. I don't even know where to go with this one.
Yeah, by the way, the club that people were submitting, their influencer pitches to, it costs $23 a night to stay there.
Yeah.
Like, turn in some recyclable bottles, do a couple of Uber drives and pay the dude. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's just unbelievable, some of the pitches he was getting. The article is worth it. If anybody has time, read the article that I post in the show notes. It's definitely worth it. Well, next up, Google's groundbreaking Advanced Technology External Advisory Council that would have provided independent oversight of any AI work that the company was doing. Well, it managed to last a little more than a week, Mitch, before it imploded into controversy over who they had appointed on the panel. Nobody was happy with this panel. It lasted 8 days, 9 days, and then it was dead.
Yeah, it turns out that people who work at Google actually Googled the people that were asked to be on the panel and didn't like what they saw. Irony much, it's ridiculous. How come Google didn't Google that panel?
Yeah, seriously. And speaking of things that they should have done but they didn't do, the last AdFail of the week, a story emerged this week that during a pitch meeting to Beyoncé by Reebok, Beyoncé stopped the meeting at one point to inquire why none of the participants looked like her. I mean, Reebok denies that this ever happened. And yeah, the article's in a sketchy place. I'm not really sure whether I can verify whether this actually happened or not. But at the same time, you can totally see this happening. I mean, this is not like it's that hard to understand that this kind of stuff actually happens in advertising.
Yeah, I actually think that this was New Balance pranking Reebok. This sounds like a New Balance thing, to be honest.
It does, doesn't it? Oh, well, we'll have something to add to this list or just want to discuss it. Comment online, use the hashtag AdFail5. That's pound, AdFail, and the number 5. Well, that does it for this week's show. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, visit our website at thebeancast.com and click on the subscribe link. If you're an Apple Podcast listener, we've also provided a direct link to our listing there. or just search for the BeanCast in the podcast directory on the Apple Podcasts app. And whichever podcast directory you use, when you subscribe, please leave us a review. Got a comment? Have a question? We'd love to hear from you. Just send your emails to beancast@gmail.com. Opening theme was performed by Joe Seibel. Closing theme by C. Jax. Thanks for listening. I'm Bob Norp. We'll be back again next week. Hope you'll join us then.
You know what I mean? It's like if it's, you know what I mean? I don't know, man. It's just like, okay, it's like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like totally like that. It's like, I don't know, like if it's, you know, it's like, you know what I mean? Yeah, it's just like kind of, it just seems like it's just like almost exactly. It's like exactly.